This video is brought to you by Sailrite. Visit Sailrite.com for all your project supplies, tools, and instructions. In this video tutorial, we'll show you the complete steps to reupholster a pontoon steering console. An old pontoon boat can completely be restored to look almost brand new with new upholstery. We took this old pontoon boat for a local children's summer camp and not only reupholstered the steering console, but we also installed new Infinity luxury woven flooring, and we also installed a stainless steel frame for a new bimini and bimini boot. Videos covering those projects will be coming soon, so be sure to watch for them and subscribe to our YouTube channel. This tutorial will show you how to reupholster a pontoon steering console. Here's what the old console looked like. It was a big mess, and here's what it will look like when we're done. Let's get started. First step, remove the old vinyl and evaluate the wood structure underneath. Before removing the vinyl, it's a good idea to take some photos of the old steering pedestal. That way, if you get confused a little bit later on, you have some pictures of what the old one used to look like. The vinyl on this steering pedestal for our pontoon boat is in very bad shape. In an effort to understand the construction of the way this vinyl cover was made, we're going to try to rip apart seams. We're going to use a razor blade here and cut along the seams so that each panel is intact. And that way, if we get confused, we can reference the panels that we took apart to reference how it was built. Once we have the old vinyl and the old foam removed, we'll be able to inspect the marine plywood to see if it's in good enough shape that it can be reused. There are what we call fabric poles on the inside of this pedestal. We're going to cut away those fabric poles instead of removing the staples so that we can remove the front panel. It has a fabric pole here, and it also has one down at that footrest. We're going to cut away that fabric pole as well. Now we have that fabric removed from the pedestal, and we'll keep it until we're done with our project so that we can refer back to it if we get confused on the way it was constructed. We need to remove the old foam. That can be done with a putty knife, as Zach is doing here. The marine plywood on this pedestal was actually in pretty good shape, except for at the bottom where it was rotted. We do not want to have to install staples into a rotted wood. This pedestal also had a lot of extra access holes that were simply covered with vinyl, so we opted to make a new pedestal out of new marine plywood. We also only cut access holes where required, so a lot of holes have been removed from the new one. We've made a duplicate of the old pedestal out of new marine plywood, reducing some of the access holes that were not needed. Cindy's going to show us how it's done. Here's Cindy.
Okay, we're getting ready to cover the steering console for the pontoon boat. So I have it laid on its side. This is the side and this is the side. The front's over here and the back's over here. To get my pattern for the side, I'm just going to trace around this shape.
Using a permanent marker, she is marking on the Dura Skrim pattern material.
Now, this is the wrong side of this pattern, so I'm going to turn it over and mark this right side facing. And then I'll make my left side off of this also.
We will be adding seam allowance, so we need to cut outside those lines by an inch or two.
So I laid the pattern on to check the other side and see if it matches this side, and it matches really well. So I know I'm okay to use this pattern for both sides of the piece. Before I cut out my pattern, I'm going to add the 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around.
Here she's using the clear acrylic ruler available from Sailrite. This is an easy way to add a 1/2 inch or more for seam allowance. Here we're adding a 1/2 inch all around. Here at the bottom, she should have added more than a 1/2 inch. She needs to add about 2 or 3 inches there. We'll show that later on. Now cut out your pattern with those new outside lines using scissors.
I'm ready to measure this long panel on the steering console. So I'm going to measure the width, and it's 22 inches. And I'll add a 1/2 inch seam allowance on each side to that, so my cut width will be 23 inches.
There's no pattern needed for that since it's a rectangle, so she just draws on top of the pattern she just made those measurements.
And on the piece, the length of the piece, I need a seam right here to pull through and secure this straight piece. And I'm going to need a seam right here also to pull through. So I'm going to measure. I'm going to give myself 2 inches to pull under the bottom. And down to this opening is 67.5, where I want to put my fabric pull, and I'll put a piece of cording in there also. So the length of this piece is 67.5. It's 15 inches. My actual measurement is 15. And this little piece down here that comes from here and goes down and gets attached underneath, I'll measure from here down to the bottom. That's 5, and I need a little bit to pull underneath, so I'm going to make that 7 plus 1/2 inch for the seam up in this area. So I'm going to cut this little piece at 7.5 by 23.
Anywhere there's a seam, a 1/2 inch should be added to that. For instance, the middle panel was 15. She's made it 16 here. On the 27.5, she just left that the same, mainly because she added extra for rolling under the back side of the pedestal. Now we can cut our marine quality vinyl to size.
I'm ready to cut my pieces for the steering console, and I've got all my measurements right here, and this is my pattern for the 2 sides. But I want to mark on the back side of this vinyl. This is the right side, so I'm going to turn it over and use the back side to write on. So the first piece I'm going to cut is the 23 wide by 67.5.
She'll just place some marks on the underside of our vinyl, and then she'll measure that distance on the length and the width. She'll use the clear acrylic ruler as a straight edge to join up the marks that she made.
Next to that one, I can cut the 16 by 23 and then the 7.5 by 23.
Let's move on to the side panels.
When I did my initial pattern, I only added 1/2 inch here, and I need about 2 inches to pull underneath the bottom of the console, so I'm going to add 2 inches instead of 1/2 inch.
That extra couple inches will be used to pull the cover around the bottom side of the pedestal, and then it'll be stapled on there.
And then the rest of it, just follow the lines around that you've already made your 1/2 inch seam.
We typically do not recommend marking on the vinyl underside using a Sharpie marker for possible bleed through. We really recommend using a pencil, though she started with the Sharpie marker. We're going to use that same pattern for the opposite side of our pedestal, so we need to flip it so that it's upside down. The writing is facing down. That way we have a mirror image for the other side. Then cut on those lines with scissors, cutting out the vinyl.
I'm going to cut the pulls for the back side of the cover out of this scrap fabric, and these are just cut a random length, random width, so enough so you can pull on it, and a little bit narrower than my cut piece so that it doesn't get into the piping. You can see all the pieces I have cut here. Here's the long one that goes all the way up and over and to this piece right here. Here's the piece that applies in the center. Here's the piece that applies at the bottom. And here's my side piece. And then this is the other side piece. Okay, we're ready to sew our pieces together, and we've added a 1/2 inch seam allowance on each side of this and cut it at 23. The measurements of this are 22. I'm going to test and see how much this stretches, because I definitely want this to fit snug. And if I put it at a 1/2 inch on each side, which is what I was figuring for my seam, this really does have a lot of stretch to it, so I'm going to cut off a 1/2 inch, which will make my seam allowance, the piece that I added, just a 1/4 inch on each side, and that will make this snug across here when I stitch it all together.
Most vinyl will stretch a little bit, so that's what Cindy was doing there. She was determining how much it'll possibly stretch, and she's cutting off the excess on one side of it so that when it's stretched, it'll fit snugly on our pedestal. To dress up the appearance of our console, we're going to add piping. That's next.
Okay, I'm ready to sew the piping all the way around this shaped piece. And I'm going to use the edge of the fabric for the edge of my piping and match them up. And I'm also going to tilt the fabric just a little bit to the left so the stitching stays away from this edge right here, and then my next stitching will be closer.
This is the preliminary stitch that will secure the piping around the perimeter of this piece. By slightly tilting the assembly as it is being fed to keep that stitch away from the piping, that ensures that this first stitch that just secures the piping will never be seen. We're using the Sailrite UltraFeed LSZ1 sewing machine. This sewing machine has a cording tunnel built into the standard foot. Here we have to make a 90-degree turn. Cutting a slit like this in the piping flange will make that turn easier to make. Our Sailrite UltraFeed sewing machine is set up in the Sailrite UltraFeed industrial sewing table and workhorse servo motor package. That is why we have this incredible slow speed control. And you may not notice that with this rather thin assembly, we have phenomenal power to punch through thick assemblies. So combine your UltraFeed with the UltraFeed industrial table and workhorse servo motor, and you get unmatched slow speed control, extreme power, and a sturdy workstation with a quieter operating UltraFeed sewing machine. Let's concentrate on turning this corner. A slit is made in the flange. The sewing machine is powered so the needle lands right at that turn, and we bury our needle. Notice that because we're using the workhorse servo motor, we didn't have to roll the balance wheel around by hand to do that. That's incredible. We lifted the presser foot, rolled the assembly around, lowered the presser foot, and then continued to sew. Here's an inside turn. She will bury the needle, lift the foot, roll the assembly around, lower the foot, then she continues to sew. That creates a slight pucker in the flange of the piping, but that can be cut out later on because that inside turn created more fabric at that corner. Here's a 90-degree inside turn. Needles buried at the turn, presser foot is lifted, assembly rolled on that needle, piping turned, presser foot lowered, and then she continues to sew. Now later on we're going to cut that piping flange, you'll see that. So that's basically how you sew the piping around the perimeter. Let's move on. After the piping's been sewn on, here are the inside turns. She cuts a relief slit at those turns on the vinyl, not into the stitch, and that relaxes that inside turn. The opposite side of the pedestal has to have the same process done to it. We're sewing the piping onto this. We will not show this since the process is exactly the same as the first. Coming up next, we'll sew the top panel to the middle panel with piping in the middle. Here's a look ahead of what it looks like when it's done. This will help you to give reference to what you're doing. So the top panel is draped over our wooden assembly. The middle panel comes directly after that, and there's a fabric pole on the back side that is pulled through the wooden structure, the slot in the wooden structure, and that pulls the vinyl up snug against our wooden pedestal. Now for the steps to accomplish this. Now we need to sew piping on one small end of the top panel. Before we do that, let's talk about the end of the piping.
Before I apply this cording, I'm going to open up the vinyl piece and snip out the filler so that I don't have so much thickness right at the seam when I put the pieces together.
Here's a look ahead. That piping that we cut out is now on top of another panel and it's being sewn to it. So right here where that needle is entering, the piping we cut out is missing. So it makes this rather thick assembly here less bulky, and it also looks better when it's done. Now back to where we left off. Skipping ahead to where she reaches the end, she cuts off the excess piping. Then she'll open that up and remove about a ½ inch or so of the inside core. And here too, that makes it less bulky when we have to sew the adjacent panel to this panel. We do not do any reversing to lock the stitch in place because we will sew another panel on top of this and we can do the reversing there instead.
Okay, I'm ready to sew this middle panel onto the long panel. And I'm going to turn it over so I can sew on this side.
When sewing together, outside surfaces should face each other.
And apply the stretcher to this side. Once again, I'll match up the edges.
On the underside of this assembly is the middle panel. Then you have the top panel. And then on top of that, you have the stretcher or the fabric pole. Again, Cindy is sewing so that the stitch is right next to the piping. It's going through the cording tunnel of the presser foot. Here the stretcher is too close to the end, so she cuts off a couple inches there. Now it's a few inches from the end. That's perfect. The stretcher will be used to pull through the boards to bring up the fabric to the structure. Here's what the top panel and the middle panel look like when they're all sewn together, with the piping in the center and the fabric pole sewn in. Now, before proceeding, you should take that assembly and test it to see how it fits. Not necessarily the top panel, but the middle panel, because it has to be the right size. So we'll actually take that fabric pole or stretcher and place it inside of the slot of our wooden structure.
Make sure that your pieces fit before you go any farther. So I'm going to pull the stretcher in, and the stretchers I'm pulling down, so we're going to attach it to the back side of this piece. And make sure that that's snug, and then smooth this down so to make sure that the seam right here is going to land in the right place. And it actually looks like there's no seam allowance, but because of the stretch on this vinyl, there will be a seam allowance there, and it'll stretch nice and snug when we get it all sewn together. If this piece does happen to be too long, this is the time to trim it off before you sew your piping on for the next piece. Okay.
Next, we'll sew piping onto the bottom panel. We'll remove the cording as we did on both ends of this. We will not show that whole process. Then, this bottom panel is sewn to the middle panel with the fabric pole placed on top. Outside surfaces are facing each other. Fabric pole should be a few inches from the end. Same process. Now the top, the middle, and the bottom panel are all sewn together. Fabric poles are in both positions and also piping. Now Cindy tests for a good fit. Because she's only one person, she's going to place a staple that's temporary in the back of the fabric pole for the middle panel. Now she can test the bottom panel without having to hold on to that pole from the inside. Yes, it looks like it's going to be a really good fit. And now we need to join the side panels with face panels. That's next.
Here's our side panel, and here's the corner where this piping will fall. So I'm going to start stitching and go from this corner down, and then turn it over and go from this corner all the way around the other side. That way I know that these two places where the piping is will land in the right spot. I'm going to fold this like this so I know right where that corner is, and make a little snip so I can see it on the top side, because that's exactly where I want this seam to land. So there's my snip where I want the seam to land, and I want the seam to go down towards this center panel so it lays nice and smooth.
While you're watching this, look at the super slow speed control that we have with the Sailrite ultra-feed sewing machine set up in the industrial sewing table with workhorse servo motor. As Cindy is sewing, she ensures that the edges are lined up as best as possible, and she is feeding that piping through the tunnel of the presser foot. Take your time here. The side panel has quite a bit of shape, and she wants to ensure that the piping lands right where it needs to. So here is another turn coming up, and watch what she does. You can actually stretch or shrink or push a fabric in if it's too short or too long. Here she's determined that it's a little bit short, so she's going to pull a little bit on this assembly as she's sewing it. And that will actually stretch it a little bit. You can't do that too much, but you can do that to make small incremental changes. And there, it's coming out just about perfect, right? So that piping is right on that transitional fold, or transitional turn is what I should call it. And now here's a new turn. So she's going to make a few slits in the vinyl that's laying on top. At that corner, she'll bury the needle and she'll pivot the assembly. First she'll lift the presser foot, then pivot the assembly. Then she lowers the presser foot and continues to sew. And here is the bottom panel, the last portion that she needs to sew together. And some reversing should be done here to help lock the stitch securely in place. Now half of that side's been sewn on. The other half still needs to be done. It looks good. So now she can turn it over and sew the other half of this.
Now I can turn it over and go the other direction. When you have a really thick area like this, sometimes it's hard to get this back under the presser foot so that you can stitch again. So I want to get my feet, the bottom of my feet in line underneath here, lower the presser foot, and then I can pick up on this back here and get lots of height to slide my thickness back underneath there, and then let it down, and I'm ready to stitch.
Here comes another turn. She makes a slit, being careful not to go deeper than a ½ inch, which it looks like she did a little bit too deep there. Hopefully it won't cause any problems. She went a little too far, so she lifts her presser foot, and with the needle out of the assembly she can actually pull the fabric back. Now she makes that turn. Sharp turns that need to be made can be done with the needle buried and the presser foot lifted and then lowered again. Another turn, the same process. We're going to move along here since all this is relatively the same as what you've already seen. Once your sewing is complete, turn the cover right side out and inspect the piping, especially at corners. If you're a little bit too far, you can always put it back into the sewing machine and stitch closer to the piping.
When I apply the other side, I'm going to start at this top corner again and stitch down so that this corner matches, and then down the rest of the way, and then I'll turn it all over and go all the way around this edge like I did on the other side. So first I want to fold this again and find where the corner is. So I want that clip to be right at where the seam is when I begin sewing.
Since we've already shown this process for the other side, we're going to skip ahead. In order to fit this cover on our wood structure, we need to make a relief slit.
Now we have to split the back of the cover so that we can get it on over this area of the console.
Here's a look ahead at that process. Cindy's looking at a side view.
So I'm going to measure from here up to here and use that as my point for how far I need to split the back open. And that's about 17 inches. So I'm going to mark the center of the back, and our piece is 22, so I'm going to mark at 11.
As you will soon see, without this slit, it would be nearly impossible to pull this cover over the pedestal or console. The console has a lot of shape, and it's wider at the top than it is at the bottom, so this slit will allow it to open up. Cindy's cutting the slit 17 inches up from the bottom edge. However, there's an opening, as you can see, on the front of the console, so the slit could go higher, and it typically should. In fact, we won't be able to get this cover pulled over that top portion of the pedestal. The slit needs to go up higher. We are only testing the fit of the cover. We still have to put polyurethane foam with fabric backing onto the pedestal. We'll do that in a later step.
Might have to even slit it higher than that.
We didn't show it, but we extended the slit probably 7 inches more. We're going to stop pulling it on here. We do believe that we'll get it fitted over the pedestal, especially when the foam and the silk film are added. So we're going to take it off here, and next we'll put the foam on the pedestal. To glue the polyurethane foam with fabric backing on, we'll use the 633 foam lock available from Sailrite. We'll apply the glue to both surfaces, the hard surface as shown here, and also the surface of the foam for a permanent application. Be sure to follow all directions on the can when using any spray glue. The polyurethane foam with fabric backing has a spun polyester side, and that is the side that we're applying the spray glue to, and the side that is up against the wood structure. Now the foam can be trimmed with scissors or a brand new razor blade. You may have to change the blades out a few times to ensure a good clean cut. A pair of shears works just as well. Trim it right along the edge of the wood. Laying the pedestal on top of the foam is a good way to determine how much foam is required. Then rolling it back, applying the spray glue, and then rolling it back over on top of the sprayed glue area where the foam is underneath is a good way to determine the size for each side. Here along the front portion of the pedestal, that can't be done, so we cut a size of foam that's a little bit oversized, and then we smooth it down on top of our spray glued areas. Here's what it looks like when we have the polyurethane foam with fabric backing adhered to all surfaces except the bottom. Along the front of the pedestal, there's a large hole for access to any of the steering wheel consoles and also any wiring. We're going to cut that foam away, leaving approximately an inch or two around the perimeter. At the top of our pedestal are 2 locations where cup holders will be installed. We'll cut a simple plus or X there at those 2 locations. Next, we'll use silk film to cover the foam.
We're going to lay the silk film over top of our console. It'll make the cover go on easier, and it's also used as a water barrier. So I'm going to just cut extra length here. And this is 54 inches wide, so I'm going to open it up, and it will cover the whole thing.
There are some issues with using the silk film for this pedestal or console. One of them being the hole in the back, and also where the fabric poles have to be inserted. So we'll have to make some openings there in the silk film to allow that to happen. So even though there will be some openings in the silk film, we highly recommend using it. It is a water barrier, and it will also help us to pull the cover onto that shapely pedestal. Silk film feels just like silk, thus the name, and it's also a noiseless plastic. We will not cut slits for the fabric poles, nor will we open up that hole until the cover has been installed over top of our pedestal now. It is a good idea to get 2 people to help pull this cover on since it has so much shape at the top. You'll need to pull gently because you do not want to rip out any seams. If you need to, you may need to make the slit a little bit bigger. We'll show you later on how to cover up that slit and hide it. There are a couple ways to do it. We're going to do it with Hidem GIMP. Next up, we're going to do some fitting and obviously start stapling the cover on.
Okay. Now we need to be able to get this stretcher that we attached to this seam right here through the slit in the wood. So I'm going to take this silk film and push it through that hole so that I can still get my stretcher through there.
Pushing the silk film back obviously exposes the foam slightly so that it could be prone to more moisture problems. There are ways to cope with that, but for us, we're going to just leave it exposed. You could put more silk film over the portion that is exposed just by draping it through the slot. That's up to you. Cindy pulls on the stretcher, or the fabric pole, and applies a few staples to hold it in place. It's always a good idea to look at the front and make sure you're happy with it before you put in the remainder of your staples, but it looks pretty good there. The bottom portion of our footrest is not covered in silk film, so she cuts more and pushes it in the slit so that that is protected from possible water getting to the foam. Then the second fabric pole or stretcher is placed through the slit, and it too will be pulled down tight and stapled into position. A second helper may be required here.
Tighter than that?
Yeah, can you pull? Because it's difficult to see what's going on as the person in back pulls on the stretcher.
Yes.
Alright, pull a little more. Okay. Put a staple in the center.
Okay, I'm going to let it go to get the stapler in there. Okay, tell me again.
Now, can you work on this, let's see the side over closest to the yellow wall? Hold on a minute, don't do it yet. Okay, pull a little bit. We're applying a staple in the center, and then the two sides until we're happy. Then obviously more staples will be applied once we're happy. Okay, now on the other side. Okay, pull. A little more. Okay, there you go. That's good. That seam looks good. There are wrinkles underneath by the footrest and also on the sides, but those will easily be removed when we tension those sides as well. Once you're happy, be sure to put a staple about every inch or two on the fabric poles on the inside. Now we turn it so that we can get to the bottom side, and we start pulling until everything looks good and start stapling the bottom side of the vinyl to the wood structure. To staple this, we're using the EZE TC08 staple gun from Sailrite. This staple gun shoots 1/2-inch crown staples. A 1/2-inch crown is better than the standard 3/8-inch staple because it helps to prevent the staple from pulling through the vinyl because of its extra length. The leg length of this staple is 3/8 long. That's typically what we use for most upholstery applications. Again, but the head length has a crown, that's what the head is called, of a 1/2 inch. Here we'll cut off the excess of the piping that's sticking out, and we'll staple that back so it looks good too. This is the underside. No one will see this when the pedestal or console is done. We're also using stainless steel staples that are available from Sailrite for the EZE TC08 staple gun. We'll keep doing this to all sides until it's all secured. If the cover's been made appropriately, you should find that the vinyl piping actually lands right on the corners, and it can be manipulated or pulled so that it does if it does not, because the vinyl will stretch slightly.
I'm marking the center on this foam so that I can pull these two pieces up together and then use Hardware.min GIMP to cover up this cut.
Because we're using Hardware.min GIMP, which is basically about 1 inch wide, we need to make sure that we close up this slit as best as possible here. So we have to pull the vinyl so that it's very close to each other. The closer the better. If it is too wide, in other words the slit is wider than 1 inch, then what you can do is take some scrap fabric, fold the two sides in, put a stitch in it, or 2 stitches if it looks best, and then staple it over this slit. Cindy is marking the cutout about 3 inches down from the edge of the fabric, so there'll be 3 inches of excess fabric all around the perimeter of the wood cutout. Then she'll cut it out with scissors, leaving the 3 inches of vinyl so that it can be rolled over the edge to give it a pleasing look.
Okay, now I'm going to find where the corner of this wood is, the wood frame, where it's cut out right here, and I'm going to cut at an angle down to that, about an inch away. And I'll do that on all 4 sides.
4 corners. Now we can roll that vinyl around the edge of the board, which has the foam already adhered to it, and staple it from the inside. If after everything is stapled in place you find that there are some wrinkles, you can sometimes use a heat gun and take those out. Here you can see an image before, and now Cindy will take a heat gun and apply some heat to the vinyl to hopefully take out this small wrinkle at the corner. You do not want to heat it to the point where it actually takes the impression out of the vinyl, because the vinyl can become glossy if it's heated too much. So you'll notice that she's heating up the vinyl and then pressing out that corner, and that helps to take out wrinkles.
Yep.
Notice here's a close-up of it before and after, and it definitely does look better.
But you can you see it now? It's like right. It's so slight.
The area under here, it's a little bit hard to see in the video, is a little bit loose. So we use that heat gun and heat it up. And we'll be careful not to heat it to the point where it actually takes out the texture of the vinyl. But heating it slowly like this will take out that loose spot.
I think you got it.
Got it?
Yep.
All right, perfect.
To hide the relief slit, we're going to use Hidem GIMP because ours is rather small.
Okay, we're ready to put the Hidem GIMP on the back of this to cover up the staples where we finish this off in the back. So I'm going to flip it up so I can work a little easier on it. Okay, I'm going to leave some extra here at the top to roll around to the inside, and I'll also pull it down underneath at the bottom. And I want to try and be sure that I've got the staples covered up.
This is a prefabricated Hidem GIMP. It's about 3/4 inches wide. If you found that this was not wide enough to cover up your slit, you could take some of your scrap vinyl, cut a rectangle, fold the 2 sides under, sew that in place, then take that rectangle and lay it over the slit. Then you would roll the top edge around the opening of our pedestal and staple it from the inside, and then at the bottom edge you would roll it around to the bottom and staple it there. You would not do any stapling in the center as being shown here. We need a way to attach the access panel and still make it removable. We can do that with the BeauClip. To cover this access portal, we're going to use the BeauClip and an upholstered piece of plywood. A piece of marine plywood has been cut to size, obviously larger than the opening. We'll position a BeauClip so that it will catch the upholstered piece underneath it, then we'll mark its position with a pencil. For this panel, we've decided to use 1 BeauClip for each corner of our panel. In order to attach all the BeauClips at the appropriate spot, we'll lay our board on top of our application, and we'll position it so that we hit the upholstered piece underneath. Cindy is being sure that it is straight. We need to ensure that this board doesn't move as we drill holes. So we'll use 2 screws and we'll position them within that circle but not in the center location, because at the center location we'll need to drill a 1/2 inch hole. Why are we screwing within our circle? Because that hides the hole when the female portion of the BeauClip is placed onto our upholstered piece and screwed into position. Notice here, you cannot see the holes that the screw made. After those screws are secured, holding the board in place, we can drill with our 1/2 inch drill bit. So these 2 screws will secure it so it doesn't move as we drill each one of the locations for the BeauClip. Typically, we drill through both the piece that will be snapped in place and the upholstered piece underneath. We'll do that at all 4 corners. After all 4 1/2 inch holes are drilled, we can remove the screws holding the board in place. Those 2 screws assured us that it would not move as we drilled the 4 holes. Since this board is not yet upholstered, we marked the outside surface so we wouldn't get confused on which was the inside and which was the outside. The underside portion of the male BeauClip has a round circle that will fit into your 1/2 inch hole perfectly. So now all we need to do is use these stainless steel screws and screw them in place. We probably should have upholstered the board and then installed these male BeauClips, but it'll still work. We'll just have to cut around them. To install the female BeauClip into the upholstered piece, we just simply push those into the hole as shown here and then screw them in place with the stainless steel screws. Our vinyl has foam underneath it, a 1/4 inch foam. Yet the BeauClips will still work beautifully through those, as it'll compress the foam down as it is being screwed into position. We'll install one of these at each one of the locations where the 1/2 inch hole was drilled for the BeauClip. Okay, we could have reupholstered this first before the male portion of the BeauClip was in place. We're going to upholster it now. So again, we're using the 633 foam lock available from Sailrite and gluing the polyurethane foam with fabric backing to it. Then we're going to apply our silk film and our vinyl around the perimeter, leaving excess fabric of approximately 4 inches all around the perimeter. Then we'll fold it around the board and staple it in place. To assure that the vinyl is pulled tight, we install 2 or 3 staples at the center location, then work on the opposite side, then we work on the adjacent 2 sides doing the same. After all 4 sides are secured with 2 or 3 staples at the center location, then we can staple the rest of it in place. And then we're assured that the vinyl will be nice and tight over our structure. Here at the corners, Cindy has to cut away some of the vinyl because of the fact that we installed the male portion of the BeauClip prior to upholstering our piece. No big deal, we just have to work around that. A great pneumatic stapler is the Easy-E TC08 staple gun, as used in this video. It is economical and works very well. We're using stainless steel staples for this upholstered piece since it's a marine application. After this piece is upholstered, it's ready to be snapped into position. Male portion of the BeauClip into the female portion of the BeauClip, and they hold powerfully well. In fact, as you can see, it takes quite a bit of force to lock them in position. Nice.
Looks good.
By utilizing the BeauClip, this panel can be removed with a little bit of force, and it can be reclipped over and over again. Up next, we'll add some hardware. We're not going to show adding all the hardware, but only a few select items. We're going to install some cup holders here. We already have a cutout in the wood, so we found the center, and now we will cut an X at that location. We will stop cutting about a 1/2 inch to 1 inch away from the edge of the cutout. To keep our vinyl from ripping at the end of the X, we will cut T's at the ends. And these T's are about a 1/2 inch away from the wood cutout on the underside. They are about a 1/2 inch long. And then we will extend our X, the ends of the X, all the way to that T cut. This will help the vinyl from splitting at the ends of the X. Now from the inside we can take our stapler and fold back the material and place a staple or two at each one of those folded back corners. This will keep it pulled back when the cup holder is removed to drain the water. Then the cup holder is pushed in. We'll follow that same procedure for the cutout for the actual steering wheel. We'll create an X with slits at the end of the X. We will not show all of this since it's basically the same step as it was for the cup holders. At the footrest, we have an HDPE plastic that we will screw back over top of the footrest. This will keep our vinyl from getting beat up when people place their feet on this. We've added a throttle and we've also done the wiring. Our steering console for this pontoon boat is now complete and looks great. Coming up next is the materials list and the tools that we used to make this steering console. Visit the Sailrite website and you'll find a large selection of marine quality vinyls to pick from. You'll also find great tools like the Sailrite Ultrafeed sewing machine and the Easy E TC08 staple gun. Coming soon, Sailrite will be releasing new tutorial videos including installing Infinity luxury woven flooring, installing a bimini frame, making a bimini, making a bimini boot, and all completed on this pontoon boat. Be sure to watch for them all on the Sailrite YouTube channel, so subscribe, or the Sailrite website. I'm Eric Grant, and from all of us here at Sailrite, thanks for watching.